We can start off with a question to Mark. I just want to say that the debaters will have 2 minutes to respond to each question with 10 seconds grace. So if I can get a first question to Mike on that side.
Gospel of John, that Jesus died and the Roman soldier pierced him. And he was already dead when the Roman soldier pierced him, according to the Bible. But in the medical field, I know that if a person is dead, then what happens is blood in the body becomes still and will never come out. It doesn't protrude out of the body once the Roman soldier pierces him. But according to the Bible, it says, and forth came out blood and water. If a person's dead, it doesn't come out.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good question you raise. I have spoken about this with several physicians. One is I don't know if he still is, he was just a few years ago, the head of the ER at the Portsmouth Naval Hospital. He's been involved in combat and helped those soldiers who have been in combat. And he told me, because the Journal of the American Medical Association had put out an article on the pathological effects of crucifixion and had concluded that what this was, the rupture of the pericardium, and that would have produced blood and water to come out of there. However, the physician I spoke with said that there wouldn't have been more than a teaspoon that would have come out, and so it would have hardly been noticeable. He suggests that what happened was, while Jesus was being beaten, that he probably took some strong blows to the chest at some point, and that caused a swelling of the lungs. And so even being dead, it would have had a lot of fluid and blood buildup, and being dead, if it had pierced the lung, then there would have been plenty of blood and water that would have come out of there, and he thinks that's a better explanation than the pericardium.
Okay, can I get a question to Yusuf?
My question is just, both religions believe that Jesus was lived in the 1st century, or the beginning of the 1st century. And in your opening statement and your first rebuttal, you pointed out to the fact that we cannot trust the books of Mark, John, and so forth, because it was written 60 to 100 years after Jesus was born. Can you just explain to me, why do you then rather choose to believe a source that was written 600 years later?
Thank you. Thank you for that particular question. I think you're dealing with two different issues here. When you look at the development of the Quranic text, we've never had a situation in terms of which you'd find with the development of biblical literature where you have multiple and different manuscripts. Now, this is not a debate on the textual reliability of the New Testaments, but if you look at someone like Bart Ehrman, for example, he would tell you that in the manuscripts that we have of the existing New Testament, there's something like 200,000 to 300,000 existing variations. Now, that is increasingly problematic. You don't have a question of multiply different Quranic text. Every Arabic text of the Quran is universally the same, and the Quran was always, and in every instance, historically, in the hands of the people. That has never been the position with the biblical text. The Bible has always been the property of the church. The earliest complete manuscripts that we have, the Codex Sinaiticus, dates to about probably the 4th century. If you look at the Codex Sinaiticus and you compare it to the existing particular works, you'd have many books found in the oldest existing codex, the Bible, which is not basically found in the existing New Testament. Many scholars would tell you that the New Testament that we have today is nothing more than an eclectic edition. You'd look at the Greek New Testament. That Greek New Testament that you have is an eclectic text. It's a developed text. What scholars would do, and I don't have time to explain this, is that they'd look at different manuscripts, and based on their authenticity, they would construct the existing New Testament. And based on that, they would say this would probably be what the original was, probably in terms of what the text was. We don't have a case with that in respect of the Quran. So there's never been a dispute on the Quranic text, but historically there's been a problem with the biblical text. So it's not the same to say, how can you accept something 600 years later? We've never had an issue on the Quranic text.
Okay, do we have a question on that side?
Mike, we want to know why when Jesus actually died is because it's relevant to the topic. Like you say, it's crucifixion, we're not talking about resurrection here. So when you said that when was Surah 4 revealed to Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, You email me, and a month later we'll have a debate and we'll talk about when the surahs were revealed to Prophet, peace be upon him. But this is relevant to the topic. That's why we want to know when Jesus actually, peace be upon him, actually died on the cross. Because it's relevant to the topic. So we can know that if he died in the third hour, fourth hour, fifth hour, whenever it was, then we can see
The question, please.
Okay, well, if you want to know a time, the Gospels report that it was at the 9th hour that the darkness came, and that's when Jesus gave up his spirit, his breath. So that would be 3 o'clock in the afternoon. That's when Jesus died. Still irrelevant. Oh, and since I do have a little bit of time left, I do want to respond, since I have 2 minutes. The Greek New Testament is an eclectic text, but well, the question wasn't the textual reliability. Bart Ehrman, yes, he does say 300 to 400,000 differences, but here's what he said in a book published this year. The first thing to say about these 300 to 400,000 differences is that most of them don't matter for anything. They are absolutely irrelevant, immaterial, unimportant, and a lot of them you can't even reproduce in English translations from the Greek. As it turns out, the majority of mistakes you find in manuscripts show us nothing more than that scribes in antiquity could spell no better than my students can today. Now, the real issue that the questioner asked you wasn't the textual reliability. It's, if you don't like the Gospels and they're written 35 to 65 years later, how can you like a book about Jesus written 600 years later? That's the question. And if you don't, and if you think 35 to 65 years is too long in terms of having accurate information about Jesus, you're definitely not going to like what you got about Muhammad, because there's not much about him in the Quran. Almost everything you get about Muhammad is from the Sirah and from the Hadith, which are 200 to 235 plus years later.
What about the evolution of the Gospels?
Sorry,
Mike?
guys, are you finished?
The evolution of the Gospels, touch that.
All right, can we have a, sorry, this is a, these guys can't just stop debating. So let's try and do it over. It's time for Q&A now. Let's get another question. Are you, well, yes, you are finished, Mike. Can we get a question on that side?
Okay, if you look to the fact that you said that Christ's legs weren't broken and that's why he couldn't die so fast, but on his way to the cross, he weren't able to carry his own cross. So Simon of Cyrene needed to help him carry him, so he was so weak he couldn't walk to the cross. So how would he be able to stand on the cross on his feet with his blood draining, with the nails through? But the big fact is, when you say that you have to come to the point of the resurrection, in your question, if I understand you correctly, you said that it's either a case of mistaken identity because they didn't recognize him, or it's a fact that he didn't really die. So is it he that died and walked among them, or wasn't it really Christ? Because you sound contradictory. The question is, was it a case of mistaken identity, or didn't he die, and was it him? So why is it mistaken identity if it didn't die but he walked among them?
Well, the question basically presupposes a number of issues. Firstly, you never listened to what I illustrated initially. What I had suggested when I started off, that there were certain accounts in respect to the post-crucifixion appearances that raised questions in terms of the identity of Christ. For example, I gave the issue of Matthew. When Jesus appeared to his disciples on the mountain in Galilee, they worshipped him, but some doubted. Now my question was, why did these disciples of Jesus doubt? On the road to Emmaus, the disciples of Jesus could not basically recognize him by the voice print or the actual manner of walking. Only when he broke bread they identified him. Now Mike hasn't dealt with this particular issue. The other point I've raised also is that in reading these particular post-crucifixion appearances, there are indications that seem to suggest that Jesus could have possibly survived. And I gave an account in Luke 24:36, which Mike hasn't dealt with, when Jesus said, "A spirit has no flesh and bones, as you see me have." What was Jesus trying to imply? What was he suggesting? Mike, finish it for me. When Jesus said, "A spirit has no flesh and bones, as you see me have," does it mean it has flesh and bones? Regarding the instance about Simon the Cyrene, or Cyrene, basically carrying the cross, well, that's a bit of a problematic passage, because some scholars would even say that that gives rise to the whole notion of the substitutionary theory. If you look at the passage in Matthew 27:32, it says, "And they came out, they found a man of Cyrene, Simon by name, him they compelled him to bear the cross, and they crucified him and parted his garments." Now, if you were to read that particular passage, it would give the kind of indication, again, based on the inconsistency of the gospel narratives, that Simon the Cyrene was crucified in respect, in substitution of Jesus. So I would basically even question this particular account. But the point is, Jesus' legs needed to be broken. The crucifixion needed to be applied in order to quicken the death. And that was not applied to Jesus, it was applied to the other two Roman soldiers. It was not applied to Jesus because they thought he had surmised. They surmised he had been dead already. And as I indicated, there was strong indication that he was alive at that particular point based on the doubt of Pilate.
I'm going to take one more question on each side. So one more question for Mike.
Mike, maybe not a question about the debate as itself. So one of the points he raised, he used quite a number of verses referring to Christ's with an S at the end, which you then clarified as being actually the word anointed, which is Jesus the anointed one. That anointed used in especially the Psalms that he used as one of his points, just as clarification as a New Testament scholar, would you say those words are directed as Christ or as to God's anointed, meaning those that God chooses and anoints?
I'm sorry for my American ears, but just would you repeat the final question? I didn't quite get it through the accent. I'm sorry.
That's no problem. He used scriptures, especially Psalm 20 verse 6, I think, that speaks of the Christ, or do not harm them or do not touch them, etc. Those Christs, interpreted and translated to anointed, is that Christ as in Jesus Christ, or could it also be God's anointed? Because the reason I asked is he specifically used it as a point to rebuttal against you. I want to know if it means Jesus Christ, then it's valid. If it's not just Jesus Christ, then it can mean lots of different people referring to God's anointed people.
Well, in terms of Christ, Messiah, it does mean anointed one. So, but I do think you have to look contextually here. And when it is referring to Jesus, I mean, they're definitely, when he says, you're talking about when Mary touches him? Is that when you're referring? Okay. So when Mary touches him, I mean, Jesus is right there. And he says, don't touch me because I have not yet ascended to my Father yet. So, yeah, I mean, I think Jesus is the Messiah. I think he taught, I think we can show that the historical Jesus taught that he was the Messiah. In other words, historically speaking, we can verify that. And even Muslims would agree that Jesus is the Messiah because the Quran teaches that.
Okay, last question for Yusuf.
Dr. Yusuf, I'm sure you've had this question.
I'm not a doctor, by the way.
That's Advocate Yusuf.
Oh, advocate. Supposing what Dr. Licona contended were true, what would be the personal implications for you as a Muslim?
Thank you for that particular question. Firstly, before I touch on that, I think what the previous questioner suggested, the slides that I basically showed you about God's anointed, the word Christ is used in a generic sense. But the point and the implication I'm trying to suggest is that God's truly anointed can never be destroyed. And that's a particular point in which I was basically suggesting, which Mike did not deal with. Regarding the issue on what were the implications, well, I think I've made the implications quite clear. If we as Muslims are to believe that Jesus died by crucifixion, then as a Muslim, we would be compelled to basically reject Jesus, because he would basically have died an accursed death. And so therefore, as a result of which Paul would have to necessitate that Jesus' rising from the dead would basically vindicate Jesus' death. But again, what need would God want to vindicate an accursed person? To accept that Jesus was crucified and died would basically mean that a Muslim would have to reject belief in Jesus entirely. And I would therefore encourage that in the nature and spirit of this particular debate, that we find our commonalities. Admittedly, there are differences. Why could things like the Sermon of the Mount not be the basis for which Christian theology could be based, and we as Muslims and Christians could share together and live with one another as human beings, coming into the worship of the one and only God? But as the Quran would rightfully say, they killed him not, nor crucified him, but it was made to appear unto them so. If there was no doubt on the crucifixion, there would be no need for this debate. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think we can give these two gentlemen an applause.